Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I'd like to say thank you to Charles Taylor, who's agreed to come and speak about the book Modernity and Transcendence, a dialogue with Charles Taylor, for the launch event in Amsterdam in November. So thank you, Charles, for doing that. And perhaps if you'd just like to reflect a little bit on the work and how it sits in the history of your own work to start us off.
Yeah. Well, the thing started off referring to something I wrote in the late 90s or middle 90s, which is about a Catholic modernity. And what I was, this is a kind of very strange way of approaching the subject, but I took a kind of model from an event that occurred 500 years ago, or which is not maybe a bit less than 500, but the Jesuits arriving in China and Matteo Ricci. And this was a moment before the West got off on its power trip that our civilization is superior to everyone else's. So you have a model of attempt to evangelize people from a different culture, but very sensitive to the differences in culture and making very clear distinction between the faith and the culture, not there to make the Chinese over into Europeans, but to somehow make the faith relevant to them. And then we went through, of course, the long period, 3 or 4 centuries of being on our power trip, and missionaries tended in the 19th century, very often of whatever denomination, to be exporting really Western culture as well as, or faith is encased in Western culture. And now we're gradually coming back from that, and we're fighting against that. So I wanted to make this very powerful point, but then to use it in a new way. And the new way I wanted to use it was, okay, if this is the right approach that Ricci applied in China, maybe we could think of these different temporal slices, different temporal contexts in the same way. They each have their own integrity, and you have to adapt the presentation of the faith to this context. So what Ricci was doing geographically, I thought we should try to do in terms of slices of time. And that's where the title Catholic Modernity came from. How to present the Catholic faith to modernity with the same kind of sensitivity to its own situation, which Ricci showed in China. So you take off from that, and certain general lessons come out. In particular, I already was onto the notion that the present age is one which is not dominated, but very, very importantly populated with what I call seekers, people that have some kind of spiritual intuition and want to follow them out. And that this means that a practice of the Catholic faith or any other faith, Islamic, or which doesn't allow for that, is running against something very powerful in its age. So a lot of my thinking between then and now has been attempting to unpack what is involved in all this. And what clearly arises, which is where our book comes in, is that this is not a problem, this is not an issue for Catholicism or Christianity alone. It's an issue for all the great faith traditions. And you can see a kind of split, very profound split in almost all of them, between people who want very much to continue, whose whole sense of their faith is continuity, is reference back to earlier forms. They see the arrival of modernity as a kind of challenge to this, as a danger to this, and has to be fought back against, over against the other tendency, which is people who accept that this is the new context, and even in many ways applaud the arrival of this context. And these deep divisions exist everywhere. There is a In other words, there is a what I call a primordialist tendency, which perhaps is most evident in jihadi Islam, right, where they attempt, or Salafist Islam, attempted to go back in fine detail and see exactly what was happening between the Prophet and his followers back in Medina and model oneself on that, and other tendencies. And of course, in our book, we have a very important and I think extremely insightful Muslim scholar and Imam, that is Suleiman Bashir Liang, who takes quite opposite view and sees the faith as something that's constantly developing. Well, now this struggle puts us in the contact, I think, with another reality, or another facet of our reality, which is ecumenicism. And it's clear that there is a ecumenical trend among those who take the stance of let us find out what modernity requires, which is, again, bitterly fought against by those who take the primordialist stance. And so we have in the present age, I think you can see, and something astonishing because I'm old enough to have seen it move tremendously fast. I mean, I was born, for the Second World War, and of course, in the aftermath of the Second World War, I was sort of growing up. And there we have the beginnings of an ecumenicism, I would say, of coexistence. Let's not be always slamming each other. Let's see how we could maybe cooperate. Not yet, let's not compare faith. That hadn't yet arisen, right? But okay, we'll accept the differences and we'll see how we can collaborate in various common enterprises. And then you move beyond that to a real interest in exchange, and a real interest on each side in knowing what the difference is and getting a sense of what is moving the other, to further a sense of appreciation of this, that we can actually learn something from this, if there's something there that can nourish our own faith. And so you have an ecumenicism of, let's say, let's stop fighting, to an ecumenicism of let's seek together in a very short space of time. People don't even quite notice that the meaning of this has moved. And as a matter of fact, you were very instrumental in my understanding some of this, only because you were talking very much about this kind of meeting of people from different faiths and exchanging and so on. So that's another big change. And that's something that, as it were, emerges out of and develops much further, what I was saying, in a Catholic modernity. And then I want to put this now in a further context. When you're talking about ecumenicism, there is an issue of what you could call the ethical growth of humanity. That sounds like a very much, if you like, a sort of liberal progress idea. And it's not at all like the liberal progress idea, because it has this growth of humanity has some movements forward, back, sideways, and so on. It's not at all a kind of progressive piling on top of the one step the other, nor is it Hegelian, where you resolve a tension and then move on to a further tension which takes you higher. It's something much more patchy than that, but it's something that I think you could say has not a beginning point, but a very important point to refer back to in what Jaspers called the axial age. The extraordinary thing that impressed Jaspers around 500 BCE, but give or take a century or two, you get changes in the Greek civilization, in Israel, and Indo-Gangetic plain with the Buddha and the Upanishads, and in China with Confucianism, which were very different in some ways, but very similar in other ways, particularly the rise of a kind of universal notion of humanity, of what a human being was, independent of the civilization, breaking beyond the bounds of this civilization. And this, of course, was acted on only by a small minority of people, of bhikkhus, of prophets, of philosophers, and so on, sages. And it even wasn't considered applicable to the lives of most people, and it didn't have an immediate impact on the culture of those civilizations. And we moved step by step, or stagger by stagger beyond that over time. And there has developed certain concepts of universal import, like human rights. So come back to the Catholic Church, we had a moment, a really big moment in Vatican II, where from having an official position that error has no rights, that what's important is to make sure people are in the Orthodox faith, and that as it were, trumps any kind of claim that as an individual you have a right to, etc. And to a real 100%, 180-degree turn, that the church adopts this notion of human rights and becomes one of the agencies fighting for it. Right? So how these different faiths stand to this slowly evolving sense of what humanity requires becomes the extremely important issue. How far do you go with that? And a big step was taken in Vatican II, but then in lots of parts of the church, well, that goes a bit too far. Push that, as it were, too far, and the primordialist urge is there more powerfully, and the split is even greater in Islam. Islam includes people like Bashir on one hand, and the people now running Afghanistan on the other hand. There's a huge gap there, and in a certain sense, the interfaith wars are dependent on the domination by this primordialist stance. Primordialist Christians and Muslims in many cases, can't wait to get at each other and fire at each other. And it is those who take the other stance that are saying, no, on the contrary, we have to find a way of living together. And so you can see that from the beginning, the stumbling beginnings, taking Greci as an example of how to approach the problem of Christianity or any faith in our time, you move to these wider contexts where you can see extremely important defining issues. And in a sense, the right kind of approach, right kind of attitude is a little bit illustrated by the book, this is not coming out, because precisely we wanted to look at how this kind of issue of landing in modernity presents itself in these different faith contexts. And there were, very, very interesting differences. I mean, you can see the development of, for instance, of evangelical or Pentecostal Christianity as developed by Bernice Martin, and also David as well, who worked with her on the book, as another way of the creation of a, if you like, a plurality in what was beforehand a totally unified culture. Example, that of Latin America, totally dominated by the Catholic Church. And then again, in an extraordinarily short period of time, corresponding with my lifetime, which is very short in terms of history, that Latin America moved from this totally dominantly Catholic society to a society which is really very pluralistic. If you look at Brazil today, it's not only evangelical Protestantism has benefited from this or been part of this, but also, Afro-Brazilian faiths, also faiths that are based on the indigenous people. And there even is a world faith, which I discovered when I visited Brazil, in the sense that it exists in all parts of the world, which is a kind of marriage of the Afro-Brazilian on one hand and the Aboriginal on the other hand, which has a lot of people following it in Japan. I mean, this is mind-bending, or in terms of what the world looked like when I was growing up. It takes a minute to get your head around this, but this is part of the reality in which we live.
Charles, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. And one of the key insights, I think, Staf Hellemans and myself have taken from reflecting on your work in the context of this book is that there is this potential shift as well from your original idea of Catholic modernity to this notion of religious modernities. And pretty much all of the thinkers, bar one, have taken on that intuition that you have launched and fed it into their own religious tradition. I mean, is that something that were you excited by that in the book?
Oh yeah, very much so, because I I felt looking around and knowing people, of course, of almost all these faiths, I felt that something very similar was happening here, but not the same because it's not the same context. And so it was great to see it, as you say, developed, worked out in detail.
Yeah, no, and I think I'd also like just to ask you one word to say about David Martin, because as you know, we've dedicated the book to David, who passed away in 2019. His wife Bernice obviously also has a contribution. But could you say a little bit about what you've sort of learned from David's work and his contribution?
Oh, immense amount. I mean, David's work was tremendously important to me as a what is the word? Déclencheur, we say in French, is a kind of thing that unleashed certain things in my mind. And I'm thinking back to the general theory of secularization, which is maybe the worst named book in order to give you a sense of it. Because it's not a general theory of why there can't be a general theory in a sense. But it was just an eye-opener, because he traced these individual traditions, in this case, different denominations, quite different way of coming at all these issues, and traditions which really influenced each other, but didn't want to admit that, but were very different. Now, that came to me at a time when I was very exercised by theories of modernity and the idea that there was a theory of modernization that existed. And, I was in political science teaching at that point. So a lot of people believed in the theory of modernization, which included something called secularization, which was the same everywhere, except we were ahead of, we Europeans were ahead of everyone else. And I was trying to deconstruct that with the idea that there were quite different paths to modernity. So David opened this up in a new way for me in terms of the question of understanding secularization. And so that was a beginning point of my thinking of, which eventually came out in A Secular Age. He was tremendously important, and not just that first moment that triggered it all, but continuing, because I got to really exchange a lot with him and discuss a lot with him. And I learned an immense amount. I think he's a really towering figure in this whole turn of the understanding of secularization.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, it's been a great pleasure to have a sense of your insight into the book. And if I may, maybe just one final question. Staf and I consider your work to have launched really a vast research program that the Catholic modernity intuition really has a very important future for thinking of how religion and modernity relate across religious traditions. Might you just conclude this conversation by highlighting some of the key areas for that research project that you think need to be developed?
Yeah, well, I think the area that I'm interested in now, that is what I call the ethical growth in humanity and the way it works out, is something that we again have under theorized, because there has been this terrible tendency. Now I'm talking about within Christendom, this terrible tendency to think that there's a moment when the full revelation came, and then the job is to hang on to that and not betray that, and so on. So we've been inhibited from thinking about this kind of ethical growth, which occurs in a way that nobody owns, no particular denomination owns totally, but kind of between them all. ricocheting back from one to the other. And I think that's requires a great deal of further thinking. There's someone I think, very interesting work, which somehow hasn't yet managed to be published, by someone called Peter Dale Scott, who teaches at Berkeley. But I know him partly because he's originally from Montreal, but he's got a very interesting work on what he calls enmindment, which is something like the same idea, starting off with the intuition of the axial age and try to trace different moments when you find things moving ahead in this very chaotic, but I think directionally clear development. And this kind of fights against the idea that at a certain moment, maybe in 35 BC, CE, and something started, which must be taken as, or in 650 or whatever the Hijra occurred, and so there's a kind of resistance still to the thinking in those terms, but there's a huge field here which is immensely interesting.
Charles, thank you so much for your insights today. And on behalf of staff and myself, I would just like to thank you for a lifetime of scholarship that has inspired so many of us. And if we make any contribution at all, I think it's because we're standing on shoulders such as yourselves. So really a heartfelt thank you from both staff and myself. And thank you for giving us your insights on Modernity and Transcendence, a dialogue with Charles Taylor. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nani.